On a tiny frozen island in the middle of the North Pacific, American soldiers fought one of the most brutal battles of World War II, and almost no one remembers it. In May 1943, 15,000 U.S. troops landed on Attu, a remote island held by just 2,500 Japanese. What followed was 19 days of hell in mud, snow, and bayonet charges. This is the story of the forgotten Battle of Attu, the bloodiest island in the Pacific. Most people think of Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, the famous battles of the Pacific War. But far to the north, in the freezing Aleutian chain, a different kind of war was being fought. A war of ice and fog, of mud and bayonets, where the environment was as deadly as the enemy. This is not just a story of tactics and strategy. This is a story of survival, of courage, and of a battle that history has quietly forgotten. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan wanted to stretch American forces thin. They needed to keep the U.S. Navy off balance to prevent a quick counterattack across the Pacific. So they did something shocking. They invaded the Aleutian Islands, a chain of volcanic islands stretching from Alaska into the North Pacific. In June 1942, Japanese forces captured the islands of Attu and Kiska. For the first time since the War of 1812, enemy troops stood on American soil. The Aleutians were not some tropical paradise. They were a harsh, windswept chain of islands, often shrouded in fog, with freezing rain, deep mud, and no trees. The Japanese saw them as a strategic backdoor, a way to threaten Alaska, to disrupt American supply lines, and to force the U.S. to divert ships and planes to defend the northern Pacific. Attu, the westernmost island, was chosen because it was remote, hard to reach, and could support an airfield. On Attu, the Japanese landed about 2,500 troops under the command of Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki. They fortified the island with bunkers, tunnels, and hidden machine gun nests, turning it into a fortress. Their orders were clear: hold the island at all costs. No retreat, no surrender. They were to die for the emperor, and they prepared for a long, bloody defense. For the United States, this could not be ignored. Enemy troops on American soil, even on a tiny, frozen island, was unacceptable. But Attu was not a priority like Midway or Guadalcanal. It was a sideshow, a forgotten front. Still, the U.S. began planning a counteroffensive. The goal was simple: retake Attu, destroy the Japanese garrison, and remove the threat from the Aleutians. The operation would be called Operation Landcrab. The Americans gathered a force of about 15,000 troops, supported by over 100 ships. They knew the terrain would be brutal, but they underestimated just how bad it would be. The Aleutians were a world of mud, snow, and fog. There were no roads, no cover, no trees, just open tundra, steep ridges, and constant wind and rain. The cold alone could kill. Frostbite and trench foot would claim as many men as bullets. This was not the Pacific War of coral atolls and palm trees. This was a war in a frozen wasteland. Operation Landcrab was the plan to retake Attu. The Americans would land at Massacre Bay on the southeast coast of the island and then push inland, taking key high ground like Engineer Hill and Chichagof Pass. The plan assumed that the Japanese would be dug in, but that the U.S. numerical superiority and firepower would carry the day. What they did not fully appreciate was the terrain, the weather, and the fanatical resistance they would face. On May 11, 1943, the invasion began. American troops hit the beaches at Massacre Bay. They expected light resistance, but the Japanese were waiting in well-prepared positions on the high ground. Machine guns and mortars opened fire, pinning the Americans in the mud and freezing rain. The landing was chaotic. Men sank into knee-deep mud, their boots rotting, their feet freezing. The cold and wet were as much of an enemy as the Japanese. The terrain was a nightmare. No cover, no trees, just open tundra and steep ridges. The Americans had to fight for every hill, every ridge, in a slow, grinding advance. The Japanese had turned the island into a fortress. Bunkers, tunnels, and hidden machine gun nests covered every approach. Every yard of ground had to be taken at a terrible cost. In the first days, the Americans made little progress. The Japanese used the high ground to their advantage, raining down fire on the advancing troops. Close-quarters combat became the norm. Grenades, bayonets, and hand-to-hand fighting in the mud and snow. The cold and wet made everything worse. Men suffered from frostbite, trench foot, and exhaustion. Before the first major battle, hundreds were already being evacuated, not from bullets, but from the cold. The Americans slowly began to push inland. They took small hills, cleared bunkers, and advanced toward Engineer Hill, a key high point that dominated the battlefield. But every yard was paid for in blood. The Japanese fought with fanatical determination. They had no hope of escape, no chance of reinforcement. Their orders were to die for the emperor. Every hill, every bunker had to be taken at a terrible cost. The real killing began in the hills. The Americans pushed toward Engineer Hill, a key high point that dominated Massacre Bay and the surrounding area. Japanese machine guns raked the slopes, cutting down entire squads. Men crawled through mud and snow, throwing grenades, charging with bayonets when they ran out of ammo. This was not a war of maneuver. This was a war of attrition, a meat grinder where every yard of ground was soaked in blood. Engineer Hill became the focal point of the battle. The Americans launched repeated assaults, only to be thrown back by fierce Japanese resistance. The fighting was close quarters, brutal, and relentless. Men died in foxholes, in bunkers, in the open mud. The Japanese used the terrain perfectly, falling back from one position to the next, forcing the Americans to fight for every inch. One of the bloodiest fights was for Chichagof Pass. In freezing fog, U.S. troops advanced through narrow valleys, ambushed from both sides. Japanese machine guns and mortars turned the pass into a killing zone. Close-quarters combat turned into a nightmare. Grenades, knives, and bayonets in the mud and snow. The Americans slowly ground their way forward, but at a terrible cost. The Japanese fought with fanatical determination. They had no hope of escape, no chance of reinforcement. Their orders were to die for the emperor. Every hill, every bunker had to be taken at a terrible cost. The Americans learned that the Japanese would not surrender easily. They would fight to the last man, often launching suicidal counterattacks in the night. The battle became a slow, grinding advance. The Americans took hill after hill, clearing bunkers and tunnels, but the Japanese always seemed to have more men, more machine guns, more resistance. The cold and wet continued to take their toll. Frostbite, trench foot, and exhaustion weakened the American troops. The supply lines were stretched thin. The weather made air support and resupply difficult. The battle was not just against the Japanese, but against the environment itself. By May 29, the Japanese were surrounded, low on ammo, and starving. But they were not done. In the early hours of May 29, Colonel Yamasaki launched a final, desperate banzai charge. Nearly the entire remaining garrison, over 1,000 men, charged the American lines in a wave of bayonets and grenades. The charge hit the U.S. rear areas, field hospitals, supply dumps, command posts. American medics and support troops had to fight with rifles, pistols, and even knives. In the darkness and fog, the charge was a shock. The Japanese fought with fanatical courage, breaking into American positions and engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Americans were caught off guard, but they quickly regrouped. Machine guns and artillery were turned on the charging Japanese. The charge was broken in a bloody, chaotic fight. The Japanese were cut down in waves, but they kept coming, driven by orders and ideology. The battle raged through the night, with close-quarters combat in the mud and snow. By dawn, the charge was broken. Almost every Japanese soldier was dead. Only 28 prisoners were taken. The island was finally in American hands, but at a horrific price. The Americans had won, but the cost was staggering. The battle had been one of the bloodiest per square mile in the Pacific. The Battle of Attu was over. The Japanese had been wiped out, but the cost was staggering. Over 3,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, or evacuated due to cold and disease. For a tiny island, it was one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. The Japanese losses were even higher, with almost the entire garrison destroyed. So why don't we hear about Attu? Because it was overshadowed. Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, these became the famous battles of the Pacific. Attu, a frozen island far from the main war, faded into history. Its strategic impact was limited. The Japanese never seriously threatened Alaska again, and the Aleutians remained a sideshow. But for the men who fought there, it was a nightmare they never forgot. Attu proved that even a tiny frozen island could become a death trap. It taught the U.S. hard lessons about amphibious warfare, cold weather combat, and the cost of island hopping. It was a battle of mud and snow, of bayonets and banzai charges, fought in one of the most hostile environments of the war. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most brutal and forgotten battles of World War II, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. In the next episode, we'll uncover another forgotten battle that changed the course of the war. So stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video.